It all started a few months ago, and to be honest, I didn't expect it to get this complicated. My parents, like many parents, have always been there for me throughout my life. They've supported me emotionally, and in some ways, financially, during difficult times. I'm incredibly grateful for everything they've done, and I never want to seem ungrateful or selfish. But things started to shift, and I began to feel like the balance in our relationship was no longer fair. At first, it was little things. They'd ask for help with paying a bill here or there. I didn't mind. I mean, they're my parents, right? Helping them out was the least I could do after all they'd done for me over the years. But after a while, I started noticing that the requests weren't just occasional, they were becoming more frequent, more demanding, and more expensive. And it wasn't just for things that were emergencies, it was for everyday expenses and lifestyle choices that I knew they could manage on their own if they made different financial decisions. One of the first big moments I noticed was when they asked me to help them pay for a vacation. They'd planned a trip to an expensive resort and, due to unforeseen expenses, couldn't afford the full cost. They told me they had been saving up for a while but were short by a few $1,000s. I was caught off guard. In the past, we never really discussed vacations in this way. Sure, I'd given them gifts or helped with things here and there, but it never felt like they were relying on me so heavily for these kinds of decisions. I thought about it for a long time, about how much they'd done for me, and how it would be nice to return the favor, but in the back of my mind, I felt uncomfortable. After some thought, I decided that I couldn't help them financially with the trip. It wasn't that I didn't want them to enjoy their vacation. It was more about the fact that I was working hard to build my own future, and paying for their trip would set a dangerous precedent. I knew I had to start setting boundaries if I wanted to take control of my own finances and future. But I didn't just say no right away. I wanted to explain my position and why I felt the way I did. So, I sat down with them and had an honest conversation. I told them how much I valued their love and support, but that I was not in a financial position to help them with this trip. I explained that I was trying to manage my own expenses, save for my future, and maintain a healthy balance. At first, they were understanding. They acknowledged that it wasn't easy to ask for money, and they assured me that they didn't want to put pressure on me. I left the conversation feeling somewhat relieved, thinking that they respected my decision and understood where I was coming from. But then, just a few weeks later, the requests started coming more frequently. It wasn't just about the vacation anymore, it was for all sorts of things. Bills were piling up, and they asked me to pitch in for this and that. It started to feel like they were no longer asking as much as they were demanding. One day, it was a loan for a new car repair. Another day, it was for groceries. They started saying things like, "Well, you know how much we've done for you in the past, and it's your turn to help now." I began to feel overwhelmed. These weren't small amounts, and they were starting to affect my own financial stability. I'd work hard every day, but it felt like all my efforts were just going toward supporting them rather than securing my own future. Every time I turned around, there was a new request, and it became clear that they were taking my financial support for granted. At first, I would try to help out when I could, giving a little here, helping with a bill there, but eventually, I realized that the requests were becoming more frequent, and the amounts they were asking for were escalating. I started feeling like I was being financially drained, and the guilt that came with saying no made everything worse. I found myself questioning my own boundaries. Was I being selfish? Should I just keep helping them, even though it was starting to affect my own life? The breaking point came when they asked for a significant amount of money to cover some unexpected medical bills. It was a sum I simply couldn't afford. I had my own bills to pay, my savings to build, and future goals I wanted to achieve. After a long discussion with myself, I made the difficult decision to finally put my foot down. I told them I couldn't provide the financial assistance they were asking for. This time, though, things didn't go as smoothly as before. My parents didn't take it well. They were visibly upset. They said they were disappointed in me for not helping out, especially since I had the means to do so. They questioned my love for them and my commitment to the family. This was hard to hear. I had always prided myself on being someone who could be relied on, someone who could step in when needed. But now, I was being painted as the bad guy for simply trying to protect my own financial future. And then, things escalated. Instead of just discussing it privately, they brought the issue up at a family gathering. Imagine sitting there with all your relatives, trying to enjoy a meal, and suddenly your parents start airing their grievances in front of everyone. They made it clear that I was not helping them when they needed me most. They even accused me of forgetting where I came from and said that I was acting selfish by not giving back when they'd given me so much. The entire room fell silent. Everyone was watching, and I felt like I was being publicly humiliated. It was as if I was being forced to defend myself in front of everyone, and the weight of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. My parents weren't just upset, they were trying to shame me for making a responsible decision. They were attempting to manipulate my sense of duty, all while disregarding the fact that I had my own life to manage. This expanded version of the section provides more context, emotion, and details, creating a deeper understanding of the situation. Let me know if you need any more changes or additions. The moment the words left my mouth, telling my parents I couldn't financially support them anymore, I could feel a shift in the atmosphere. The room grew heavy, the silence thick and uncomfortable. At first, they didn't say anything, they just stared at me, as if waiting for me to take it back. I could see the disappointment and disbelief in their eyes, like they couldn't comprehend what I had just said. And to be honest, neither could I. The decision to set those boundaries had been a long time coming, but it didn't make it any easier. The days following that conversation felt like walking on eggshells. My parents didn't outright lash out at me, but I could feel the tension in the air. They were withdrawing, and I wasn't sure how to navigate it. It's not like we hadn't had difficult conversations before, but this felt different. This wasn't about a disagreement over a choice or a small issue. It felt like I was being judged for having my own life, my own priorities, and for not being willing to sacrifice my future to support theirs. Things started to unravel slowly but surely. Instead of the usual family phone calls where we'd catch up and share how our lives were going, the conversations became increasingly strained. My mom would call, but the tone was different. There was no warmth in her voice anymore, just an underlying resentment. At first, it was subtle. She'd ask about my day or how work was going, but there was an edge to her questions, like she was testing me, trying to gauge how much I was willing to give. And when I didn't offer any financial support, the conversations quickly became one-sided. You know, she'd say, her voice laced with passive aggression, your father and I aren't getting any younger. It's nice to know that we can count on our children when we need them. She'd make these little comments, almost like guilt-tripping me into helping, without directly asking. But I could see through it. It wasn't about caring for them, it was about making me feel responsible for their financial well-being. And then came the passive-aggressive comments from my father. He would tell me stories about their struggles, stories that I had heard 1,000 times before, but now they felt like subtle accusations. Well, I guess we just have to keep going and hope we don't end up in a bad place, he'd say. It's not easy getting by these days. I could hear the unspoken message, if only you were helping, we wouldn't be in this situation. The pressure was mounting, but it wasn't just coming from them. It started with my parents, but then my relatives began getting involved. I didn't expect that. It wasn't long before the whispers started. It seemed like everyone in the family had something to say about my decision not to support my parents. Family gatherings that were once full of laughter and lighthearted conversation turned into an uncomfortable battlefield. I started hearing comments from cousins, aunts, and uncles who would approach me in private, asking why I wasn't helping my parents more. You know, they've always been there for you, one of my cousins said. Now, you can't even help them out when they need you? Doesn't that feel wrong to you? Another relative would shake their head with a disapproving frown. You really ought to reconsider. Family helps family, don't they? You're going to regret this. Each time, I would try to explain my reasoning, that I was trying to protect my future and that setting boundaries was necessary. But the more I explained, the more I was met with a wall of judgment. It was like I had become the black sheep of the family. And the worst part was, they weren't just questioning my actions, they were questioning my character. I could feel the shift in how they saw me. No longer was I the dependable child, the one they could always count on. Now, I was the selfish one, the person who had chosen their own needs over the family's. The implications were subtle, but they were real. Invitations to family events were fewer, and the energy around me was colder. I wasn't just being distanced by my parents, the ripple effects were spreading to everyone else. But the backlash didn't stop there. My parents weren't just disappointed in me in private anymore. They started telling people about what had happened, using me as an example of how children can be ungrateful and distant. It was as if I had become a cautionary tale. During family get-togethers, they would talk about how hard things were for them and how their own child wasn't there to help them through it. They would drop comments like, "Well, I guess we'll just have to figure it out on our own, even though we've always been there for our kids." It felt like a public shaming, and it was hard to bear. These weren't just private frustrations being shared with close friends, they were being broadcast to the entire family, and by extension, to anyone who would listen. It wasn't a matter of them asking for help anymore, it had become a narrative of me being a disappointment, someone who had forgotten their roots. And what hurt the most was that it wasn't about the money at all. If it had just been a matter of needing financial help, I could have handled that. But this was about emotional manipulation. This was about making me feel guilty for taking a step toward independence, for establishing boundaries that would protect my well-being in the long run. It was about making me feel like I owed them for everything they had done, even though I had my own life to build, my own responsibilities to manage. The guilt was overwhelming. I began to second-guess myself, wondering if I had made the right decision. Maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe I should have helped more, given more. But as time went on, I started to realize that what I was really being asked to do wasn't just about money, it was about sacrificing my own happiness and well-being for the sake of appeasing their expectations. The fallout wasn't just uncomfortable, it was life-changing. I began to understand the depth of the emotional manipulation I had been subjected to, and while it was painful, it also helped me realize that setting boundaries wasn't just necessary for my financial health, it was necessary for my emotional health, too. As the fallout from that night began to sink in, I found myself dealing with emotions I had never anticipated. What I had assumed would be a brief argument over family expectations quickly turned into something much more profound. It wasn't just a matter of financial boundaries anymore, it was about the emotional strain of carrying the weight of guilt, resentment, and confusion. The emotional toll this whole situation took on me was far beyond anything I had anticipated. I always thought that family, at its core, was supposed to offer unconditional love and support. Sure, families argue and disagree, but at the end of the day, there's a shared understanding and respect for one another. Or at least that's how it's supposed to work, right? But in my case, that sense of familial connection quickly dissolved into a fog of disappointment and hurt. I was left questioning not only my relationship with my parents, but with my entire family dynamic. At first, I felt an overwhelming wave of guilt. I was raised with the idea that family comes first, that we should always be there for one another no matter what. To turn my back on them, especially at a time when they were in need, seemed like the ultimate betrayal. The harsh words they had thrown my way echoed in my mind, making me wonder if I had made a terrible mistake by refusing to give in to their demands. Could I have found another way to support them, perhaps emotionally or through other means? The question spun in my mind, keeping me awake at night, unable to shake the feelings of regret that clung to me. But as time went on, those feelings of guilt began to shift into something more complicated. I started to realize that the emotional toll wasn't entirely my own. It was a shared burden, one that I had inherited from years of unhealthy family dynamics. The expectations my parents had set for me weren't just financial, they were psychological as well. They expected me to fill a role that, in reality, didn't align with who I was or what I could offer. My refusal to financially support them had sparked a deeper rift that went beyond money. It exposed the unhealthy patterns of control, manipulation, and entitlement that had long existed beneath the surface. Each time I interacted with them after that confrontation, I could feel the shift in energy. The strained silence, the awkwardness of the conversations, the cold shoulders, they all became too much to bear. It was as if the foundation of our relationship had been shattered, and there was no way to rebuild it. I wasn't just grieving the loss of a healthy familial relationship, I was grieving the loss of the ideal family I had always envisioned. The emotional toll came from the realization that the family I had known and loved was no longer the same. The people I had once trusted unconditionally now seemed like strangers, and the connection we had once shared was slipping through my fingers. On top of that, the emotional strain from the public backlash only compounded my distress. Friends, relatives, and even acquaintances who had heard about the situation started to weigh in with their own opinions. Some sided with my parents, reinforcing the idea that I was selfish and inconsiderate. Others, perhaps well-meaning but uninformed, offered advice that made me feel even more alienated. Everyone seemed to have an opinion on what I should have done, but no one truly understood the emotional complexity of the situation. It became a constant reminder that, in situations like this, people are quick to judge and slow to listen. The constant questioning, the unsolicited advice, and the judgment took a toll on my mental and emotional well-being. I had never felt so alone, not just within my family but in my own life. The barrage of negativity created a cloud of doubt that I couldn't shake. It was as if the world was telling me that I was wrong for standing up for myself, for establishing boundaries, and for protecting my own peace. I wasn't sure who I could turn to for support, and the few friends I confided in didn't seem to understand the depths of the emotional pain I was experiencing. Over time, the emotional toll of the situation began to manifest physically. I became exhausted, not just from the stress of managing the situation, but from the constant mental gymnastics of wondering if I had done the right thing. My energy drained away, and I found it difficult to focus on anything other than the turmoil within my family. I'd lost my sense of clarity, and every decision felt clouded by emotional baggage. It was as though the weight of my parents' expectations, combined with the guilt and judgment from others, had created a physical burden that I couldn't escape. The emotional toll also impacted my ability to trust. Trust, once a cornerstone of my relationships, seemed like an impossible ideal. How could I trust people who had made me feel like I owed them something I could never truly give without sacrificing my own well-being? How could I trust others not to judge or betray me when my own family had failed to see the complexity of my situation? It felt like a betrayal, not just from my parents, but from everyone who chose to judge me without understanding the emotional and psychological dynamics at play. Despite everything, I knew I had to learn to take care of myself. I couldn't allow the emotional turmoil to continue to define me. I had to find a way to separate my identity from the expectations of others, to find peace within myself despite the judgment and pain surrounding me. It wasn't easy, and there were many days when I felt like giving up. But slowly, I started to rebuild my sense of self-worth, piece by piece. I began setting stronger boundaries with my parents, refusing to let their emotional manipulation affect me as deeply. I focused on healing, both mentally and emotionally, knowing that in order to move forward, I had to learn to live with the emotional scars and let go of the guilt. The emotional toll of that night and the weeks that followed was far from over, but I was slowly learning how to navigate it. And even though it felt like a never-ending battle, I realized that by refusing to give in, I had started the process of reclaiming my own emotional health, my peace, and my identity. In the end, the experience taught me invaluable lessons about boundaries, self-worth, and the complexities of family dynamics. While the emotional toll of the situation was heavy and at times overwhelming, it also pushed me to grow in ways I hadn't anticipated. I learned that standing up for myself, even when it felt like I was letting people down, was not only necessary but essential for my mental and emotional well-being. It wasn't about rejecting my family, but about preserving my own peace and recognizing that I couldn't continue to sacrifice my happiness for their expectations. The situation also highlighted the importance of setting healthy boundaries in all relationships, especially with family. It's easy to fall into the trap of guilt and obligation, but true love and support shouldn't come at the cost of personal sacrifice. The road to healing is long, but I'm learning to navigate it with more self-awareness and confidence. Though the fallout remains, I've found strength in knowing that I've done what was best for me, and that ultimately, taking care of myself doesn't mean I love my family any less. It simply means I'm learning how to love myself more.